What's up, guys? It's your favorite Kiwi coach, and give me 6 months of your time. I'll give you the best golf swing of your life. So welcome back to the channel. In this particular video, we're going to be reacting to another athletic motion golf video where they're doing a pro versus am. This one is going to be with the hip slide. This is a very popular topic that a lot of our clients come into lessons all the time and ask about. Am I sliding my hips? If I'm sliding my hips, why is that bad? And then also, if it is bad, how can I actually go about fixing it? So if you're interested in that and you want to see a gears 3D breakdown of the pro versus am with the hip slide, this is the perfect video for you, and let's go ahead and jump in. But before we get into the video, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, and that is Kiwi Golf Japan. If you did not know, YouTube does not pay the bills. So if you want to help support this YouTube channel, down below after the video is over, there'll be a link to our Kiwi Platinum membership site. And if you guys sign up, you guys will really help support this channel and get access to a bunch of videos just like this. So with that out of the way, let's get into the hip slide with athletic motion golf. So before we get too far into the video, let's go over some of the major points we'll be talking about. And then from there, we'll get straight into and start reacting to this video. So like we said, this particular video is all about the hip slide. They're going to be showing you a gears breakdown pro versus am, not only from the down the line view, but also the face on view as well. If you take note, you'll see some arrows here that are colored. So the blue arrow will be the right hip movement, the red arrow will be the left hip movement. So we'll break down all of the differences between the two, a little bit in the backswing and most of the downswing. And then from there, I'm going to talk about some key movements that you could change relative to ground reaction force that should allow you to help to change these movements and then also get rid of the hip slide. So let's go ahead and start reacting to athletic motion golf, how to get rid of the hip slide.
In this episode of Pros versus Ams, we're going to look at two common hip slide or hip sway patterns that we see all the time amongst professionals and amateurs. We've got our pro on the left, our amateur on the right, and we're using red arrows to track the left hip, blue arrows to track the right hip. And we can see, as these golfers go to the top here, two key differences. One, our amateur has much...
All right, let's stop it here and start to break down the video. So like they said, amateur is over here, pro is going to be over here. There's two major differences that they wanted to bring up in terms of the top of swing movement. And the first one is going to be the overall tilt of the pelvis relative to the ground. So both of these players have tilt relative to the ground, right? So they're not parallel at the top with the pelvis. However, the pro golfer is going to have much more tilt relative to this amateur golfer, which is going to be a really important key point when it comes to the hip slide. Also, the other thing they wanted to take note of was going to be the overall pelvis rotation amount. So this particular amateur golfer has a lot more pelvis rotation than the professional golfer. So pro golfers typically average right around 45 degrees. This amateur golfer is actually right around 60 degrees of pelvis rotation at the top. So this is a very common amateur golfer who, might have been told, hey, you're not hitting it very far, so you need to get more hip churn so you can hit the ball far. And they kind of took that information maybe a little bit wrong, and maybe it wasn't as specific as it could be, the information. And next thing you know, we got a player that has a really flat pelvis rotation, as well as just a massive amount of pelvis rotation. Now, they don't talk about the main reasons on why this is an issue, so I'm going to briefly just cover one of the main issues. And then from there, what I'm about to say will make a whole lot more sense as we move through the video. But one of the major issues when you have a really level pelvis rotation, it has to come into kind of what type of force you're applying into the ground. So if you rotate your pelvis really, really level, typically the magnitude of force, or really how much power you're applying into that ground, is not as much as the pro golfer who has a lot more tilt of the pelvis. So the pro golfer will be applying more force into the ground versus the amateur golfer over here would not be applying anywhere near the amount of force into the ground. This will be a key important part, because what happens is when you don't have that connection to the ground, not only can you not move laterally the correct way, but also you can't stop that lateral movement as well if you don't have the correct magnitude of force into the ground to be able to do this. So this will be a reoccurring theme that we're going to be talking about in this video, but let's just go ahead and skip forward and let's start getting into a little bit of the downswing and start to break down the differences between the right pelvic movement and the left pelvic movement, because this is a really interesting point of the video.
As we scroll them down, we can see that our pro, right at left arm parallel in that.
All right, let's stop it here, guys, and let's start to break down exactly what's going on. So let's start with the pro golfer, because that's where they started as well. So I want you guys to take a look at this blue arrow right here. This is going to be resembling of the right hip or the right pelvic bone. So now as we start to go and transition, we're going to see that the right pelvis is moving kind of back away from the target line. Then it starts to arc back out towards the target line. And then notice how at the very end, there's almost a slight bit of arcing, like it's almost starting to level out and the downward movement is starting to lessen. This is a really important part. Now also take a look at this arrow right here, the blue one, relative to the red one. We can see the blue one is much higher than the red one, which just simply means the right pelvic bone is much higher than the left pelvic bone at this point, right? Left pelvic tilt. I'm sure you guys have all heard of that. It's a really important point. Now, if we take a look at the amateur golfer over here, we're going to see a pretty massive difference. So let me skip ahead to the video where they highlight the amateur, and then from there we can see a little bit more close-up view of that and compare it to the pro. Okay, so now we have the amateur's hip movement highlighted, and there's a massive difference relative to the pro. So first off, let's just take a look at the height of the right hip versus the height of the left hip. Now, yes, you could argue the right hip is slightly higher than the left hip, but if we take note relative to the pro, it's actually much more on the leveler side, these two hips, than the professional golfer, right? So the professional golfer has a lot more left pelvic tilt than the amateur golfer at this particular point, which is really, really interesting. Now, also, if we take a look at the overall motion of the right hip, at first glance, it's quite similar to the pro. However, if we take a look at the very end, this is one of the most different parts about the two. Notice how this one is actually starting to arc downwards as we're approaching position 5, right? So the right hip is moving downwards versus the pro golfer. If anything, there's a little bit of an arc almost going upwards. So pretty much completely different movements at that point in the golf swing. And this is very common, right? So we're seeing the amateur golfer move towards that right pelvic tilt at a faster rate than the professional golfer, right? So the right pelvis is leveling out relative to the left pelvis much, much quicker. So then again, this move right here is another move that is reducing the amount of force that is applied to the ground, which just means that this player is having less and less force applied to the ground, which means the feet are not really gripping the ground anywhere near as much as the pro, which will be a major, major issue as we start to continue with this video in terms of the hip slide. But those are some pretty massive differences. Now, if we take a look at the overall left hip movement, we can definitely see that there are some unique differences between the two. I would say in terms of the professional golfer, it definitely has an arcing motion away from the golf ball and up. And then also if we take a look at the amateur golfer, there's definitely a little bit of a away from the golf ball and arcing motion as well. But the overall degree is a little bit flatter, so it's a little bit more parallel to the ground in this section versus the pro golfer is a little bit more up in this section, which is, again, just complementing the right hip movement the pro is. And then the amateur golfer is basically just trying to move the hips more parallel to each other. I don't think they're consciously trying to do this. That's just what they are doing at this point. So now let's continue to move forward. I want to go into position 6 now because there's some more unique differences between these two. And then from there, there's also some face-on differences, which we'll get to later in this video as well. That'll be really interesting, so stay tuned.
I'll work out for our amateur golfer. We can see him well short at left arm parallel, well short of square hips. And we can also see that right hip now starting to work under the left hip. So he gets him square right here.
All right, let's stop it here. So this position is pretty much right around P5.5, almost position 6, and we definitely are starting to see some massive differences between the two in this down the line view. So first off, I think the most noticeable difference is the pro looks like it has a lot more rotation than the amateur golfer. So one of the main reasons for this is going to be just the overall tilt of the pelvis between these two. So again, remember the amateur golfer was a lot more leveler at position 5, which means that they're already starting to move towards right pelvic tilt too early, which tends to make the overall hip line look more closed than it really is. And then also because the amateur golfer started off with 60 degrees of pelvis rotation at the top versus 45 of the pro, that's also a major reason on why the overall look of these two look quite different amongst the two. So those are really important there. Now getting into the more important parts, in my personal opinion, let's start out with the right hip movement. So remember, right around position 5, we were starting to see this arrow almost start to have a little bit of an arcing motion upwards, and we can kind of see that arcing motion continue from P5 to P6, right? So this right hip is definitely staying more above the left hip at this point relative to this amateur golfer over here, right? So that's a massive difference between the two. Now, if we go look, and they've highlighted the position 5.5 right hip movement for the AM, we can see that this arcing motion has continued to go down with this amateur golfer. So the amount that the right pelvis has dropped relative to the left is so much more in this amateur golfer than the pro golfer at this current time in the golf swing as well. Now also, let's go take a look at the left hip here. So remember, the left hip, yes, now it's starting to kind of get that arcing motion upwards, very similar to the pro golfer. But if you look at the overall amount, the angle relative to the ground, the pro obviously has a much more steeper angle, a much more vertical angle relative to this amateur golfer. And then also, we can almost see a little bit, it's kind of hard to see, but it's definitely starting to arc up at this point, this left hip, at this kind of P5.5 section. So some really massive differences in the movements between these two. And you know, a lot of it, in my personal opinion, has to do just around the concept of the downswing pivot motion. Maybe this amateur golfer was taught that you need to churn the hips more. Then from there, you need to have the lower body beat the upper body into the ball or something on those lines. And whenever you tend to see someone try to do that, you tend to see the pelvis movements move like this, and we tend to get a pretty big hip slide, and there's no braking force with the footwork to be able to stop that hip moving forward. Nor is the player even trying to have that braking force, which is a really big difference between the two. So let's continue to move forward. I think there's maybe one more section with the down the line, then we're gonna hop into the face on, but let me go check real quick. All right, that's it for you guys on YouTube, but before you guys click off, let me give you some quick wrap-up points. So one of the most interesting parts, in my personal opinion, between the amateur swing and the pro swing was just the overall pelvis tilt amount at the top of the swing as well as throughout the downswing, the differences between those two. As we saw with the amateur golfer, towards the top, the pelvis was really level relative to the ground, which just means the overall magnitude of force was kind of displaced out, and it wasn't really kind of directed vertically down, and we really just didn't have that connection with the feet to the ground, so that we couldn't apply really any type of force on the downswing to really stop this sliding motion. So that could be a key point you guys maybe focus in on. Obviously, we don't want to get too much tilt. We don't want enough tilt. So you got to make sure you get the correct amounts, but something on the lines of that could really help you with the slide so you can connect to the ground and be able to stop yourself from sliding. Now, if you guys want to watch this whole video, because there's a whole lot more that you guys didn't get to watch on YouTube, definitely make sure to sign up for the Kiwi Platinum membership site. Not only do you get access to this video, but I think right around 320 other videos are currently on the site as well. And then also, obviously, it really helps support this YouTube channel, and we need your help to continue to make this thing worth it for us. So definitely make sure to go sign up for that. Other than that, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share, all that good stuff, and I'll see you guys in the next video.